on, dude? Welcome back to the show. It's our, I don't know how many times we've been on, but it's always a pleasure. What's going on with you?
Yeah, I appreciate you having me back again. No, I always enjoy these chats. So what's going on? Normal day-to-day things, I guess, with all the things that we'll probably talk about on this episode about training and all that fun stuff.
Yeah, you're my go-to. Hey, I need to have a really niche discussion about things that probably don't matter, but are intellectually stimulating about hypertrophy. So let's get Bryan on. We'll talk about it. Yeah.
How do these episodes do compared to like the more generally acceptable, macro tracking and stuff like that?
They do exactly what you think they would do for the kind of person that enjoys this chat. I get multiple DMs of people that, like, since I said you and I were going to podcast like 2 weeks ago, people are like, oh my God, I can't wait. They don't do as well, like total listens or like actually the biggest is they don't get listened to as long, because I'm sure that we lose people sometimes, but I know for a fact for the person who's like excited about, these topics or just being a smidge more nerdy about things, that it really, for them, it is a key episode. And so I'm cool with that. And for me, honestly, this podcast has always grown out of like just wanting to talk about this stuff myself. And so if this one gets lost on some people, listen, we do. I think we do a good job making sure that we don't go too deep into the weeds and use too many deep, intricate words that people don't know what they mean. And so, but yeah, I could understand if you're like, hey, if you're listening to this podcast for 2 minutes in and you're like, I don't give a shit about hypertrophy, I don't even know what hypertrophy means. Okay, maybe we go back to another podcast and we circle back around to this one. Yeah.
I think it's clutch to have both types of podcasts. You can go do the ones that you really like, and that's kind of what you've earned, like your right to do these. And then you have the ones that just reach more people, and that's good too.
Yep, totally agree with that for sure. And again, you're just hitting different audiences, and that's fine. Let's break down. I made a couple of notes, just like what we were going to talk about today. We're going to do, and there are a couple of things I didn't, you're not privy to, that I just thought of in the last like hour or so, but we're going to be talking about progressing across a mesocycle, like setting up a mesocycle and progressing across a mesocycle. And we're going to look at two distinct ways of doing that. We're going to compare, like, in air quotes, like the RP, Renaissance periodization, Dr. Mike style, where, and I'll just lay the groundwork and we'll get into it. But that style would be like, in week 1, you are going to do all of your sets with the same RIR. And it gets a little bit more intricate than that, and we'll get to that. But let's say you have a overhand grip, wide grip pull down, let's say, and you have 3 sets. You're going to perform all 3 of those sets to the same RIR, which means that you will probably end up with descending reps from set to set, because as you fatigue, you have to keep the RIR the same. And so if you're roughly hitting a 3 RIR on all your sets, you might have 10 on the first set when you feel really fresh. And then in your second set, what 3 RIR will feel like now, because you're a little bit more tired, might be 8 or 9 reps. And then in the next set, it might be 7 or 8 reps. And we can talk about whether or not that actually practically takes place. But we're comparing this idea of doing the same RIR on each set versus what we would call maybe a descending RIR, which you would program as like a 3-2-1 RIR, where your first set of an exercise, that same pull down, is a 3, the second one is a 2, the third set is a 1. And that might yield a more of like an 8-8-8, where as you're getting fatigued because the RIR is descending, that you are now being programmed to try harder, and your increased effort might correlate with your decreased effort, or your increased in fatigue and your decrease in performance. And you might end up with it more of same reps across. And we're going to have a discussion today about, I think we've both experienced, at least in some degree, both of them. I know that you were more recently poking your head into some of the descending rep in an attempt to like kind of have more context for this conversation, but that's how I'm doing it right now. And you're doing more of like more of that RP style. That's how I trained for a really long time. I worked with the guys at Revive Stronger. And so that's like very much their methodology as well. And so I think we both have a good case. And I don't think either of us are going to be standing behind this is the best. And there's no, I think it's good though, that each of us is doing one of the other ones right now. So we do have like very local or very recent context to discuss it in. Did I miss anything on that?
No, I think that's pretty solid. I would say that in the premise of this conversation, it's probably like, hey, I'm the guy that's more aligned with RP, and you're the guy that's more like a descending RIR. And I think that I don't want my progression model to be confused with one of RPs, because I think that in general, the overarching way in which I progress things is not anything like RP. The only part of the way that I do things that's like RP is potentially this idea of static RIR on a given day and then decreasing that week to week instead of set to set. But I also think that throughout my training the last couple of years, I have actually used a lot of the descending RIR approach without thinking of it that way, because I still was progressing it in that way week to week. And what I mean by that is like week one would be, lateral raises. Say it's like you go 3-2-1 as your RIRs in week one, and then it's like 2-1-0, and then it's 1-1-0, and then it's 1-1-0 plus partials, or like whatever that progression model looks like. It still has like a framework of kind of descending RIR set to set. Where I haven't used it, and I feel like maybe my stance is a little bit stronger, is on like big fatiguing compound movements. I don't necessarily like that idea of using the descending RIR. So what are your thoughts kind of on the disparity or the differences between how you might apply it for those two types of movements?
Yeah, I definitely want to get to that. I think it would be helpful to just maybe talk about the similarities between these two approaches. And let's assume, like you just mentioned, kind of a hybrid approach where you might take certain exercises, like you might feel differently on an exercise selection basis. Let's assume for a second we're not taking that approach, and we're just like, hey, everything's going to be week one is a 4 RIR, week 2, 3, then 2, then 1, then 0, then deload, right? Let's assume that's what we're doing for a second. Like, what would you say? And I can start if it's, obviously I didn't ask you this beforehand, but like, what would you say is like, well, okay, I see the descending RIR, I see the static RIR side. Where's the overlap, and where do these both check the probably the most important boxes?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's actually a really good way to pull that back and get us to clarify things a bit. So the interesting thing about both of these approaches, and maybe I just assumed that people would get this, but is that the average RIR that you're performing is probably going to be the same week to week. So where you might have a lateral raise in week one that goes like 3-2-1 RIR, it's averaging 2. And I might just say, hey, all of my lateral raises are 2 reps from failure today. So we're still averaging the same RIR, and we're just having one easier set and one harder set, right? That would be the main thing that I would say. How about you? What do you have to add to that?
No, that's spot on. And I think even more zoomed out than that is that both of these methodologies involve a general concept of beginning your meso further from failure and moving closer to failure from week to week. And then on top of that, if you were to layer, again, hypothetically, if you were to add up all the RIRs that I would program in a descending, and you would add up all the Rs, and they'd average the same number. That might not be true, but we can assume just in this bubble to compare things with one variable that would be true. Like you said, you might be 2 RIR on all your lateral raises. I might do a 3-2-1, which on average is the same. It's a 2. And so both methodologies follow 2 concise rules. One is that we're going to start generally further from failure and progress closer to / beyond failure over. You're just starting with easier training, working harder week to week. And on average, we're probably doing a very roughly similar week to week and across the entirety of the mesocycle, the average, the same RIR. This is more of a, how are we splitting this up? Are we doing it all on the same day, 3 or 4 RIRs all today, and then next week all 2s and 3s, and next week all 1s and 2s, and then the next week all 1s and 0s? Or is it a 4-3-2 this week, and a 3-2-1 next week, and a 2-1-0, and a 1-0-0, and then a 1-0 failure beyond failure? And at the end of the day, that they end up with the 2 most important things I think do hold true. And I think that we're going to talk a lot about the parts of the Venn diagram that don't overlap and why they are different and why we might have personal preference. But I do think you could adopt either of these in a logical programming sense and make amazing. I mean, they check the 2 biggest boxes for me by far.
Yeah. Anything beyond like those basic principles that you mentioned is like so nuanced that it's actually kind of funny that we're having this conversation, but I love it. So
yeah. So do I. There's definitely at the end of the day, like sometimes these are like, there's a bunch of, there are parts of nutrition and hypertrophy that I think are eerily similar, or at least I feel similarly about them, because they both, like, let's just take fat loss, for example. There's just so many ways to induce a deficit, adhere to a deficit, arrange your calories, arrange your macros, when you can eat, how many meals you eat. There's so many ways to do this that all yield in a very tight window similar results. And that just allows you to layer a lot of personal preference. And it's the same with hypertrophy. I feel like we've talked about the forgiving nature of hypertrophy and how there's like just a lot of ways to logically skin the cat. But in the same breath, we are still left needing to make a decision, right? It's like, oh, none of this stuff really matters. But then you still have to decide, okay, which one of these am I going to do? So you still you're not flipping a coin. If there's one straw that tips the scale, okay, then you go with that one. And so we're going to be dealing with those little straws here. And so,
yeah, and it's mostly psychological, I think. Like, I mean, when you make a decision of two basically same things that cover the basic principles, you're choosing the one more or less that, you like to do better, that fits your lifestyle better. Oh, I like intermittent fasting because then I don't have to think about food for a meal. Like whatever it is, they're getting you to the same place, and it's your psychology that's kind of influencing it.
Yeah, agreed. Would you feel comfortable throwing a couple of points as to why you might prefer? I know that you just mentioned maybe a potential difference in exercise selection, and you can go into that if you want, but hey, you're sitting here, you're on the stand. Why do you like doing static RIR?
Yeah. So what's the way to say this? Do you find that most people, when they do implement the descending RIR, that they're matching reps set to set? So you might see that like 888, 321 RIR or something along those lines.
In the beginning, yes. I think that once you have a set to failure that isn't your last set, you should expect a drop off. And that will happen if you start with 321, next week 210, then the next week is a 1-0 beyond failure, potentially, right? If we're just doing numerically, it would be a 1-0 -1. And so once you get to that point where not your last set is a failure set, you should be okay with understanding that, hey, any set that I do after a failure set should have less reps. Just for the broad, it's like, it's almost impossible for you to do a set to failure. I would probably say practically it's impossible to do a set to failure, and then the next set after that to match reps. So when you're saying 321, do I suspect that will roughly yield same reps across? I do. I would put the word roughly there and a little squiggly line, right? And the way I would describe it in my program is I usually write that. I'm like, hey, if the RIR feels a little bit daunting, this, chances are you're on the right track. If this is yielding a roughly similar 888 or 999, give or take a rep, as you're figuring this process out. So I do kind of plug that as like an expectation, or at least a ballpark of like, okay, I probably did this like roughly decently well.
No, that was a great caveat. And I love that you actually include that in your program too, with like kind of some writing about that, because one of my bigger problems with it is in the way that would get implemented by the masses at large. Because I think that there is such variance between whether you can sustain a rep number or not as your RIR drop. And I think the avatar of that applies that also varies a lot too, where you can have somebody that's relatively new to lifting and they can completely botch the first set, and maybe they're like 6 RIR. And then when they actually get to their failure set, they're getting like 6 more reps than what they got on their first set. And so it's great in that sense that like you're getting them to a failure set early to be like, so they're aware and they're saying, hey, wow, I really misjudged that. So that's really good. But I think that there is like in the communication of it, there seems to be like a broad expectation that as reps in reserve decrease, that you should in theory be able to like match the reps that are prior. And I just think that that's probably not always the case. And it can make it difficult to just transfer that message to people and kind of communicate it to the different avatars that kind of exist within the programming.
Yeah, that's totally true. There's at that point is 100% true. If I don't, even if I write, hey, you're going to roughly get 888, there's somebody out there who's going to be, and the truth is we're better at assessing RIR the closer we are to failure. So you might do 8, 9, 10. And I do see that sometimes where people are like 8, 9, 10, just, I'm trying harder on these later sets. And I'm like, yeah, if I see an 8, 9, 10, I know that wasn't a 3, 2, 1. It just wasn't. And to be honest with you, like, what I find again so fucking awesome about hypertrophy is like, if someone's like, hey, I did 8, 9, 10, did I do this right? Like in my heart, I'm like, that wasn't a 3, 2, 1. But what I know is that like, if your 8, 9, 10 was like an average of, if you combined the RIRs of those, like what they actually were without knowing, just if we had a genie that could tell you what the average RIR was, and it was like roughly 3 to 4 to 5 in the first week. And then all you do is progress from there. even if it wasn't my magical 3-2-1, like it was what I needed it to be, which was stimulative enough to cause growth, but not so stimulative that, you know, you're maybe less likely to progress over the long term or setting yourself up for worse training in the future. It was in the ballpark of where I'd like you to be. And if I were to like try and convince you that that descending RIR was better, I'd probably say what you said, which was that you will more frequently and sooner in the meso experience a 0 RIR checkpoint to kind of shit test yourself. Now that is more valuable for those who are learning RIR. And if you are an advanced trainee, then this point makes less sense, because I can do straight static RIR and descending RIR the same. I feel very confident in my RIR assessments. But what I mean is, just for the listener, is like, if you're starting with a 3-2-1 RIR in week 1, the next week I will write 2-1-0, and I will also write a little blurb that reminds you that that last set, I know that we're focused on progression, and I will tell you, I say, hey, I really just want you to focus on progression. But in addition to that, I really need this last set to be failure. Now that last set might give you the experience of having done in week 1, 8-8-8. And then in week 2, you're like, well, Jordan said I just need to progress, so I'm going to do 9 and then 9. And then on this last set, he told me, okay, fuck the progression. I need to literally just go objectively to failure. You get 9, you get 9, you get 13. And what the take home is from that is that, okay, 9 and 9 and 8 and 8 was probably way further from failure than I really thought it was. And I've learned that in week 2. Whereas in the static RIR, I might go 3 to 4 RIR in week 1, 2 to 3, 1 to 2. And then in week 4, I'll experience failure. And maybe in week 4, I had done 9 in week 1, then 10, and then 11, then 12. And then in the final week, when Bryan told me to go to failure, not to put your name on it, but then I got 17. And it's like, holy shit, the whole meso was I wasted the entire, I quote, wasted the entire meso. Yeah. Now, devil's advocate on that point is that while in my scenario, this person only learned this helpful information on week 2, just to play devil's advocate, is if I were to counter, it would say that, okay, regardless though, one person, it took a week and a half to figure out that they were sandbagging it. The other person took a mesocycle. But over the many years of training, that's the same information on a blip on the radar. And that person who figured out in week 5 that they could really do 17 in the next mesocycle will know that and will start with 14 or 15 or 16, and they will know, and they won't make that mistake again, is my, in theory, they wouldn't make that mistake again. So it's not really in the long term a big difference, but I do want, and so I'll finish my point in a second, but let's take the descending RIR group. They're going to do a failure set in week 2, and they're going to do another failure set in week 3, and presumably 2 failure sets in week 4, and maybe 3 and whatever. They're just experiencing that more frequently, not more total, because what we said as a preface to this is that both groups are going to, on average, do the same amount of RIR training, but maybe more frequently exposed to that failure. I have other arguments, but let's just pause on this one real quick, because whatever, you get a chance to monologue.
Yeah, no, appreciate it. That was really good, and I agree with pretty much all of that. And that also kind of goes back to that original point I made before we took it back a notch, where I said that I prefer this actually for these isolation, or to even be more specific, short overload movements. But I really don't like that approach.
Let's explore that.
Yeah, let's talk about that. And/or compound movements. And so what I love about doing that descending RIR approach on the short overload movements is that it gets people quickly to failure, to partials. And like, as we've discussed on prior podcasts, like you tend to sometimes incorporate like a reverse drop set or a partial kind of from the beginning. And you have people use sub failure approaches to partials. Whereas I prefer to get people to partials as a progression model, from reps in reserve to failure to partials to reverse drop sets to whatever comes next. So I love the descending RIR for that reason on short movements, to get people to failure and then subsequently to partials earlier in the mesocycle. Can
I pause you for 1 sec? So just two things. One, whatever. I like doing both of what you just said. We are doing this mesocycle, a partials as progression, and another exercise with a momentum as progression, which is going to be fun. Just like a strict press to a push press, nice. Which is going to be fun. And then also just like a lateral raise with a progression into partial. So I'd love that as well. But what you're saying is, okay, short overload movements, single joint / short overload movement, probably more importantly, the short overload side of things. Ironically, for the larger muscle groups, they also tend to be single joint. They use like leg extension, hip, ham curl, but you prefer the descending RIR because it gets the person. So what I'm hearing is, hey, short overload movement on average, I'm going to start closer to failure because I might actually, and that's funny because the topic I want to get to next is this like reassessment of stimulus to fatigue ratio. But basically to kind of tease that, it's like, hey, these short overload movements, maybe I can train a little bit. Maybe it would be best for me to train a little bit closer to failure with these. My question is, why not just start all of the lateral raises at 1? And because like what I'm hearing is that you want to train those closer to failure, or you that's how you prefer to program it based on the discussion we'll have in a second. But why go 2-1-0? Why not go 1-1-1?
That's a good question too. I mean, I just kind of like the idea of on the single joint movement warming up into it a little bit. So one of my points that was going to be a pro point for the descending RIR was going to be that it kind of mitigates the need for an additional warm-up set, because if you're doing like a short overload isolation movement at 2 or 3 RIR, that can kind of act as a warm-up set that's also giving you a couple effective reps. And so the simple answer to that is like, hey, instead of 1-1-1-1 or whatever it is, I feel like you would need an additional warm-up set to get to that 1 rep from failure set versus just doing a 2 to 3 RIR set and then being like, wow, there's a pump, my shoulders are warm, take a break, get to my heavier set from there. Yeah,
that makes sense. And a soft counter is that's actually, I agree with that point. I love the idea that there's a pairing between, like, so let's just understand the concept that as you go from set to set, there's probably an upside down U-shaped curve in neurological efficiency. What I mean is like from set 1 to set 2, you probably get in a better groove with your technique. Maybe even set 2 to set 3, you get in a better groove with technique. Maybe set 3 to set 4, it's a better groove with technique. That doesn't pan out forever. Eventually it's the opposite and you end up, we've all been to that without trying to put too many scientific words on it. We've all been to that point where like, there's a reason if you're doing like 7 sets of something, that the 7th set isn't just better than the 3rd set. Eventually that graph of neurological efficiency, it goes down, your technique gets worse. And so one of the things I like is that and I think you can relate to this by the idea of a top set where you're pairing when the person is more neurologically efficient, maybe 2nd, 3rd, 4th set, when they're like really in the groove with that higher effort. And that just is, again, I think these are all very weak arguments because I still think 99% they're the same because of the 2 big things we talked about, descending RIR on average over the meso and starting with easier training, ending with harder training. But one of those is like, maybe 1st and 2nd set, I think a lot of people, even with proper warm-ups, are kind of like, well, even maybe they don't even do proper warm-ups, and those end up being not a warm-up, but some form of a bridge to get you to your hardest set. And I do like that kind of pairs together. And so I think you kind of would agree with that. It's kind of what you said for those lateral raises is one of the reasons that you might use that.
Yeah. And then for the reasons that I like it, the static RIR approach for the compound movements is because it really feels to me like once you do a set, let's just take an example here. So we're taking an RDL or a hack squat, something that you're probably not going to go to like absolute failure on. And maybe in the final week, maybe not. Like I often don't program RDLs to 0 to 1 RIR ever. So we'll just assume that 1 RIR is the furthest you're going to go, right? So once you get to a point where your big compound movement is like a 4-3-2 or a 3-2-1 or something like that, and you have that heavy set that is your final set, it almost feels like now you're taking that Brian Miner like philosophical approach to progressive overload that's like watching paint dry, where you're like, I've already taken this progression as far as it can go, like kind of early in the mesocycle, and now I just kind of need to wait for progressive overload to happen, versus if I'm like, hey, week 1's 4 reps from failure, then with 3 reps from failure, then 2 reps from failure, and then the final week is 1 rep from failure. There is that inherent like small victory, that win that you're getting each day that you go into the gym, where you're not just showing up to do this compound movement to fucking feel like ass at the end of it and feel like you failed because you didn't actually accomplish your objective of improving or progressing. It's like progression is handed to you on this golden platter, like, hey, add a rep because you have to get closer to failure type thing.
Yeah. And the counter to that is there's like 2 different counters, one of which is in a kind of an agreement, but for like a backwards reason. The counter is, well, like, I would just start your RDLs at 6-5-4. You know what I mean? Like, or 5-4-3, right? If you're doing a 4, then why not do a 5-4-3? I think your argument of, hey, if you do a descending RIR, most of the time it's being programmed by somebody who's not considering what we're talking about, which is maybe we don't take these axial loaded things to failure as often, right? Axial loaded, lengthened overload, compound lifts. Maybe we don't take those and so what you might often see is the same RIR program for those movements, and the lateral raise and the RDL are polar opposites in terms of stimulus, like in basically every way. Resistance profile, axial loading, how much they load the spine is what axial loading means. And so you're saying, hey, programming 3 to 4 really protects against that issue of people going to failure before they really should. And if it says 3 to 4 on every set, there's no two ways about it. You're absolutely not getting that close to failure this week. And if you do, then it is like categorically like wrong. You did this wrong. I love that as a protective mechanism. The counter is just programming 5-4-3. However, I think practically speaking, I have seen that as well. And so I will make sure that I program things like 5-4-3 or 4-3-2. And so I take that information in as well. And I totally think that there's, at the very least, the take home. I think what you're doing is saying, hey, they're probably very similar, but if I write it this way, I probably get more people to not make this mistake. And I love that reasoning, because again, we're talking about the margins here of like, at the end of the day, like, how do I communicate this at the very least to a large group so that they have the least likelihood of fucking it up, when in reality, either way would be fine. So that's kind of the deal breaker. And I really do love that. That's the best motivation, I think, for sure.
Yeah. So that's really like the way I kind of feel and use them in programming. And so I'm actually like really glad that I spent the last, 3 or 4 weeks dedicating to using descending RIR, because I wouldn't have realized how much I actually really do enjoy that for the like short overload, lower fatiguing movements. But there's like literally no part of me that wants to use that for the big compound lengthen movements.
I wrote down that, and I want to like red team this argument here. I wrote it down the other day, and now I'm trying to work back what my argument was. I wrote down that with the descending RIR, you will have to quantify RIR less frequently. So my goal as well, maybe it's just a group programming based goal and not like an individual peak athlete goal, is to get my athletes, my clients, the people in the group, to do what I know they should do without analysis paralysis or, feeling overwhelmed. And so it's a delicate dance that I know you dance as well, where it's like, hey, I want to teach you RIR and tempo, but I also want to like make sure that that these are a tool to get in a ballpark. They are not like in and of itself. The perfection of this thing isn't as important as, you getting, like we said, starting relatively far from failure, but close enough to make gains and making progress over the meso. Like, how do I get my group to do that? And what I kind of was thinking was, if you have a 3 to 4 RIR, let's say you're doing the RDL and it's 3 or 4 RIR, you have to communicate to your group that they will not get the same number on each set. They will get descending RIR. And sometimes from set 1 to set 2, maybe you can match, because the first one was like a pseudo warm up, and the second one, you're feeling neurologically a little bit more primed and ready. And I've done this before where I'm like, hey, I matched reps and it felt like a similar RIR. Well, let's assume that if you're doing static RIR, then the reps must fall as you get more fatigued.
That's means how I teach it. Yeah.
And that makes more sense. Again, the circumstance of where you'd match reps is like, that happens. But it's not something that you suspect. It's not how you would teach it. So in that context, I have to calculate my RIR every set. And I'll play devil's advocate to this in a second. You can too. But in that circumstance, I need to do 10 at 3 RIR, or I need to do 3 RIR, and then I get 10. And in my next set, I need to, again, focus on getting 3 RIR, because I'm not focused on getting 10 again. I'm focused on getting 3 RIR, which might be 9, which might be 8. Right. And so I need to be in my head again about the RIR. And then set 3, I need to be in my head again, RIR, because I'm not shooting at a number. Very gently, the descending RIR, again, at least in weeks 1, 2, and 3, you're probably going to get similar reps across. And so the way I would, at least if we're in a courtroom here trying to make a case, is that I would say, hey, if you can nail the first set at 3 RIR, you don't need to calculate RIR again, maybe for the entire meso. Maybe the entire meso you've already nailed by getting this 3 RIR. Now, you could say by getting it wrong, you also now have fucked up. That's where the more frequent going to failure, I think, plays a role. But if you nail that first set at 3 RIR and you get 10, you could, I would stand by this. You could get 10 on the next set and 10 on the next set. And it's probably a 2 and a 1. And it took away the thought process of you needing to calculate RIR again in that second and third set. And if you show up next week and you got 10, 10, 10, you can, again, just lean into progression and not really need to, in my opinion, you could probably never worry about RIR again. except for when your coach says, hey, specifically, I need this last set to failure because this is our shit test of like what you think you've been doing. Versus if I have the same RIR every set, the counter argument is I'm guessing for you guys, and you can correct me, is like you might say 3 to 4 RIR on everything. And then in the following week, like, yeah, 2 to 3 RIR and everything, but also try and focus on progression. And so you might also, that need to calculate RIR every single set, every single week might drop off over time, and you might gently lean more heavily on progression, or am I off there?
I actually would say that the same exact argument that you made about not having to think about RIR can be applied to my model as well.
I wrote that. Go ahead. I literally wrote that. Go ahead.
But also,
would you drop a rep? Would you my argument is that you can match reps. Would your argument be like, yeah, that's cool. You can assume a rep.
Drop a rep. Yeah. So the other argument, like the counter to your argument, is you're saying, hey, we're starting at 3 RIR. But if we're talking about an RDL, which is the way that I would use this, you're talking about starting it at 5 RIR because you're saying you would start at 5-4-3 or 6-5-4.
Sure.
Well, now the possibility of your client getting this wrong at 5 RIR or 6 RIR is way, way, way more than me at 3 to 4 or whatever it is RIR. So the risk of messing that up is certainly higher. But even with my model, to go back to that point, it's like, okay, you're going to try and get a 4 or 5 RIR this week, 3 to 4, we'll say. Week 1, 4 RIR. You're going to go 10-9-8 or something along those lines, 10-9-8, 10-8-7, depending on what type of athlete you are. So I try to coach that a little bit too. Like, if you're a more endurance based, you need less rests between sets type athlete, then maybe you can go like 10-9-8, or even in the earlier weeks, it might be like 10-10-9, like to your point, you don't really know. And then you're more like explosive, fast twitch athletes like me. If I do an RDL to 4 RIR, my next 4 RIR is going to lose at least a rep, if not 2. And then the one after that would probably lose 1 rep or 0 reps. So there is some variance in there, but once you nail it the first week, it's the same idea. You literally I say, hey, you add 5 pounds or you add 2.5 pounds, depending on the movement, whatever it is. And then you just try to nail the exact same reps. And so you turn your brain off. You don't have to think about it too much.
Yeah. It's my exact words are, maybe in practice, you could do something similar with something like a 1 rep drop off and then just focus on progression, ... same shit. That's literally my exact word. So I totally get that. Yeah. That's cool. That's, and it is interesting. There's just like, brings it back to like, there's something that there are going to be people that listen to this that either have experienced both or have just experienced one. They're like, oh, this really clicks for my brain. And at the end of the day, that's what we're talking about here, is like, which of these things really clicks for your brain? And more than anything, the big takeaway I think that I would at least want to prescribe is that, like, I think that RIR is cool and all, and I am big RIR component. My content talks about it. My program has it in there, but shit, getting close enough in week 1, like RIR in week 1 is where I really need you to like ballpark where I need you to be. And then from there, it's forward and it's up. And if you do that, you're just so close to getting all of the way there. And on top of that is like, we're talking about a single mesocycle. We're talking about figuring out all this stuff in a single mesocycle, but that isn't what training is. It's like stringing of mesocycles together. And so, this idea of like, oh my God, if I do it Bryan's way, I'm not going to get as many frequent failure sets as what Jordan said. And maybe I waste the whole mesocycle, not training as hard. Okay. So what? If you have that same movement in again, and you keep some air of continuity in your training, which you freaking should, then this all really does work itself out. And, you might be like, oh my God, I'm like, what's the best way to get better at RIR is to keep your movements the same, focus on progression, occasionally purposefully go to failure. If you do those 3 things, like, you will get better at RIR. And more importantly than that is you will spend more time training in the right place, which is stimulative, whatever relative intensity that you're supposed to be at that time. I think it figures itself out.
Yeah. So to that point, like, I just think, using those short overload movements and getting people to failure quicker and getting them into partials and stuff like that, it makes huge sense to do the descending RIR and get them there in, to week 2 or 3 or whatever, because the fatigue cost of doing a lateral raise or like a tricep push down to failure is, basically non-existent when you look at the grand scheme of things. And then being a little bit more prudent with compounds, like, I think both of our ways obviously can work, but for the reasons we've discussed, you have that ability to kind of start somewhere, figure out where it is that you're starting, get that right, and then it's just move forward and progress from there.
Yep. Excellent. Let's let this a really good segue into the next is this. we're going to talk a little bit about a notion called stimulus to fatigue ratio, is popularized by Dr. Mike Isertel, as just this understanding that things that you do bring a certain level of stimulus and they bring a certain level of fatigue with them. And the ratio between those two things can guide you to getting the most out of your training. If you're doing things with a really good stimulus to fatigue ratio, then you can probably do more of them and you can get more stimulus per unit of fatigue. And under the understanding that we have a finite amount of recoverability, a finite amount of this fatigue that we can accrue. And if you have 100 fatigue points and you can get 200 stimulus points versus 150 stimulus points, that over time, obviously those are just totally arbitrary numbers, but you can make better gains over time. And one of the discussions of SFR is this proximity to failure, understanding that from some of the research we have that we see a very similar, if not identical, growth stimulus from training to something like 1 to 3 RIR, let's say 2 to 4 RIR. I mean, honestly, there are studies that are like, hey, 5 RIR and 0 RIR are the same. I mean, there's studies that go that far, but if we're being a little bit more, I think, putting some of our anecdote and evidence and understanding into play here, let's say that the thing that you and I will discuss today is this notion of, hey, don't train to failure, because you can get a better stimulus to fatigue ratio. And what I mean by that is roughly the same stimulus for less fatigue if you train, let's say 2 to 3 RIR. Do you have any problems with that, or maybe not problems with that, but like any things that you would expand upon as far as not maybe just accepting that at face value?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Man, I just literally lost my thought. I had like the perfect thought. So I'll go to my second thought, which is fresh in my brain right now. Which is that I think when you look at the general overview of studies that are done on these types of things. Oh, the first thing I was going to say was volume equated. That was going to be the first thing I was going to say. Cause literally, I mean, if you're talking about doing 3 RIR and compared to failure, it might be having to do 4 sets or 5 sets instead of 3 sets. Or can you hold on?
Can you expand on that a little bit? Because that is just not talked about enough.
Yeah, that's the main reason. That was the thing that was in my head initially. So basically, if you have, the easiest way for me to think about this is to use the effective reps model. So I know that's not perfect, but we'll just use that. Yeah. So if you have sets at 3 RIR, and your effective reps means the last 5 reps before failure. So you have rep 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 that are basically effective reps. If you're doing everything with 3 reps from failure, then you're only getting 2 effective reps on each set. So if you did 5 sets, you would get 10 effective reps. Whereas if you did 2 sets to failure, you get 5 effective reps on each one of those sets. So you would only have to do 2 sets instead of 5 sets in that case.
And these studies they are equating volume. The problem is these studies are equating volume. So they're doing what you said, which is like, hey, if I match volume, if I do 5 sets at 3 RIR, which means I get like you just said, the last 5 are the ones that really count. And so if we have 5 that could potentially count, but I'm leaving 3 in the tank, that means I'm getting 2 out of every set, that I've accumulated 10 effective reps over 5 sets. But if I do 2 sets all the way to failure, I'm getting 5 on each of those. So I'm getting 10. The problem is that those 2 things might be equal, but that's not the takeaway for most people. Most people are like, oh, that means I can do 2 sets at 3 RIR or 2 sets to failure, and I'm going to get the same stimulus. That is not true.
Yeah. And they don't do a great job of communicating that when they talk about studies. Like the headline is always like, not training to failure, just as good as training to failure or whatever. And so, yeah, it's very confusing for people. And then, so the second point I was going to make is that when you look at just studies generally, and this doesn't apply every study, but most of the studies that show that you can get great results training further from failure are done on like big compound length and movements. And then most of the studies that are done on isolation movements are done to failure. So it kind of creates a little blur in the research there as well.
Yeah. And so just a small devil's advocate, like a set to failure. If you take any exercise and like, this would be clear, like if you take any exercise at a 3 RIR and a 1 and something at a 0 RIR, you get more stimulus and more fatigue for the 0. You get less stimulus, less fatigue at the 3 RIR. That's both true. The argument is that the ratio of the 2 would be better at 3 RIR. Now, you brought up a really important point, is that I guess you brought it up, but in my opinion, that misses the mark in terms of exercise selection, that there's just a big, in my opinion, in my experience, that we're not at a place where we've done these extensive studies, but the actual exercise that you're talking about changes how I view this. And, when you think of taking a back squat to failure, I think you could make a really reasonable argument, like maybe slightly contestable, but you could make a reasonable argument that juice might not be worth the squeeze, that there's more risk, it's more likelihood that this SFR argument of maybe don't take it all the way to failure. You could make more of an argument that makes sense in that regard, because it's such a fatiguing movement. And there might be a big gap between what a 0 RIR back squat feels like and a 2 RIR back squat. Those two, in my opinion, just like the emotion that evokes you when you think about those things, if you've done them, they're very far apart. A 2 RIR back squat, you can do no anxiety. A 0 RIR back squat, very intense, very systemically fatiguing, neurologically fatiguing, anxiety driving, let alone, physiologically also more fatiguing. But the gap between a 2 RIR lateral raise and honestly, for me, like a beyond failure into partial reps lateral raise is quite tight. And that, when we talk about fatigue, in my opinion, we have to distinguish between systemic and local. Like, I'm systemically going to be fine from a beyond failure lateral raise. That's not going to bring so much fatigue that it's like overflowing my ability to recover as much as maybe the back squat does. How do you feel about that?
No, I agree completely with it. Like, it feels as if when you take that lateral raise set 2 and beyond failure, the extra fatigue you're creating is local. Like, it's right there in the lateral delt. Like, you can feel it accumulating. But when you take that same back squat set, at 2 RIR, your quads are rocked. Like, you've created a ton of juice and done what you need to do there. And then those extra 2 reps, it's like, there's always the argument of like, are you even doing them the exact same as the prior reps? Like, where is the exact failure point? Because the hips shifting in a back squat is like a very gradual process in most cases. Like, it's not like one rep is perfect and your torso is upright, and then the next rep you're doing a good morning. I mean, this happens super gradually, and it could be over the course of 5 reps that your form compromises and changes. But the speed of the rep might not actually change because you're just compromising your positioning instead of actually grinding through that position. So I think it becomes so ambiguous at that point. That if you then begin to compromise form at all, you're shifting load into those structures that receive fatigue much more aggressively than the local musculature.
And this all super cool to like for us to like pontificate about. But if we look at like the average person's what's the average person's barrier to getting their best gains? It's not optimizing SFR. It is, if you were to optimize SFR, if you were to equate volume, like we talked about, and you're like, hey, I'm only training 3 RIR and I'm going to do as many sets at 3 RIR as I need to equate for stimulus or get the most out of it, the workouts would take too long. Like that's a big problem I have. Like if you're like, hey, 5 sets at 3 RIR is going to give you a better SFR than 2 sets at 0 RIR. First of all, I would contest that we know that for a fact. But if you're telling me it's a 1% better, but I have to spend an extra 15 minutes doing it, then it's a no-brainer. And then maybe it's not 1%, maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 8%. But I think that whatever it might be is not more important to me than his workout takes 90 minutes to 2 hours. And that might even in itself be a confounding variable of people's ability to work out that long and get that sort of effort. And so, it doesn't seem to me that like I learned about this whole SFR. I have multiple podcasts with Ryan Solomon and Steve Hall came on here. We talked about it. But in practice, I think that it's more looking at the exercise, the resistance profile, the axial loading, the systemic fatigue, how like emotionally draining that movement is. And the more of those things it is, maybe the on average further from failure you can go, or where that SFR is peaks might be further from failure. But for like, a high stability, single joint, short overloaded movement, like I can do a 90-degree preacher curl, which is like my favorite exercise and literally favorite exercise, like short position, mid to short overload. I can take that like to the point where I can barely move my arm and flex my elbow at all. And I get up from that and I'm fine. And my bicep got a ton of stimulus. And maybe you could say, hey, 2 sets of 2 RIR would have been 5% better. I'm like, yeah, great. That's going to cost me another 4 minutes. I can't extrapolate that across every body part. And I just can't be here that long.
Yeah. I have to work pretty hard just to fit the common sense approach to training that we have into 60 to 75 minutes. Like that's what our programs are. We say 60 to 75 minutes and it's hard just to fit that in without, trying to do 5 to 6 sets of everything with 4 RIR or something like that. I mean, I couldn't even imagine. And then kind of one thing that Greg Nuckols always says, I heard him on a bunch of podcasts be like, come on, would you ever like just take a bicep curl to 3 RIR? Like, why would you do that? You just take bicep curls to failure, like just like to your point, where's the fatigue? The fatigue is right there in the muscle. You're not breathing hard. You're not crouched over, like trying to gather your senses or anything like that. You're just like, yep, that was a bicep curl. Let's do the other arm,
And a lot of the time, I think you and I would agree though, that while we can have this intellectual discussion and application, we're going to be leaning on closer/beyond failure on things that are not lengthened overload, maybe things that aren't axially loaded, maybe things with higher stability. And when you do those things, that just decreases all the systemic fatigue, and that does not spill over at all. And so all you're really getting is just more local stimulus, and confounding variables is also an opportunity to teach people to lean into pushing people all the way to failure, which is a subset. Obviously, that's not a scientific argument. It's more of a practical thing where it's like, hey, like, I'll tell you right now, there are exercises in my program that we take to failure every week from week 1 forever. There are different reasons why we do that. It's rare. It's usually when I think the workout's getting pretty long, but I really need you to do this exercise. So we might do less sets, and I might just say, hey, this is an opportunity. You need to experience what this feels like. Is that something that I know that you on average will take something closer to failure, but maybe it'd be helpful just to talk about, like, I love how you've dealt with this process of, I'm not taking my lateral raises to 4 RIR, then 3, then 2. I'm going to start them at 2, but once I get to, or start them at 1 or whatever. And once I get to 0, I'm actually going to not just stay at 0. I'm going to continue that process on. So maybe run the listener, just I'm sure if they follow you, they kind of have an idea, but run the listener through what that might look like for you.
Yeah. So that's kind of the progression. Like week 1, a lateral raise might go like 2-1-1 or 2-2-1 or something like that. And then by week 3, we're pretty much at like 1-1-0 plus partials. So what that basically means is it's kind of like a shit test for yourself, because this is like a secondary benefit of partials that I think is kind of under discussed. Because I always think of it as like, hey, it just makes sense based on this study. Like, you got to take these muscles through the length and position. They're too short overloaded, like all of these big terms and phrases. The simple thing that I'm getting feedback from everyone at Paragon is basically just like, hey, I didn't realize how far from failure I was until we started doing partials. And the way I coach those are, it's max effort. So you're trying to achieve the same range of motion you did on the prior rep, but you're unable to without compromising form. And so they realize that they're capable of so much more than they could. And so if we're in a 6-week mesocycle, which is the way we generally program our hypertrophy program, was like a 1-week intro deload and then 5 weeks. By week 3 or 4, we're into partials. And I have not, as we've discussed on podcasts, I still at this point have not gotten aggressive enough to program a reverse drop set in. It's coming in the next mesocycle, and I've teased it a few times, but that would be the logical next progression for me after partials. We have a reverse drop set, which is essentially adding weight and then going into partials. So you would finish your lateral raise set, say with 20s, you would finish full range of motion reps, no partials. Then you would pick the 30s up and you would just do whatever. It's usually 80% of the reps of the top set. So you get 12 on the first set, you try to get 9 or 10 on the second set. And it's basically partial reps of lateral raises from there with a heavier weight. And then something I don't think that I'm going to include into my general programs anytime soon, but as my own kind of experimentation, I have been doing a ton of lengthened only sets. And I'm not doing these where I'm trying to just only hit 50% range of motion and just maintain 50% range of motion. I'm actually trying to achieve as much range of motion as I can get and then letting that range of motion drop off. And so I'm not even convinced that way is necessarily the most optimal, but I think that at this point in my training career, 25 years in, that I don't know that there's going to be a whole lot of difference whether I do things what I believe is optimal versus let's try the experimentation pool and just kind of see what works and try and create some cool stuff for other people to learn from.
So something I find is like, I think there's a misunderstanding, maybe not a misunderstanding, but I'll have people that are like, hey, if I if I want my sessions to be shorter, like if people will use like volume as like a set proxy, and because volume is lower, can intensity be higher to mitigate the less sets? The answer is 100% yes. Is it a like for like 1-to-1 ratio change? No, but this idea that, hey, if I'm working out less, can I train harder? Absolutely. Can you mitigate the idea that you're doing less sets or less days in the gym by training harder and getting more stimulus per set that you do? Absolutely yes. And when I think of our programs, I think they're both 4 days a week. I don't know if you guys have experimented with more or less than that. Maybe you have a 3-day option as well. But I'm realizing that with 4 days a week, 60 to 75 minutes, it's pretty tough for people to reach systemic fatigue overload, systemically overtraining. I think I'm a little dancing around this because I'm sure this happens more than 0 times. I know that this will happen more than 0 times, depending on people's nutritional status and their habits and their sleep sucks. And that person might arrive at this stage more, but like you're doing a 4 to 6 week mesocycle 4 times a week, 4 to 6 exercises per day, 45 to 75 minutes, roughly decent. Like you're not at failure on everything right from the get-go. I just have not seen myself program something for the group where it was too hard on a grand scale. And I've gone as far as to do something called partial rep match, which I know that you can infer what that means, right from week 1, where you're partial rep matching a lateral raise, 3 sets, first set all the way to failure. Second set, partials must accumulate the same number as the first set. And the third set, again, same. So you might do 10 on the first one, and then 7 with 3 partials on the second one, then 5 with 5 partials on the third one. And then that's week 1, and you have to progress from there. And I have yet to people be like, wow, like 1, I'm not progressing in that at all. Or 2, I'm really like totally so run down by the end of this mesocycle, just because I think we're at that capacity where it's 4 times a week, 4 to 6 exercises, 60, 75 minutes. I think just within that structure, which is, in my opinion, the most important hierarchy here, because that's where people are going to be most adherent. I'm not saying just fucking go to fucking failure on everything and beyond failure and partials. But in select circumstances, I have yet to be like, oh yeah, this is going to kill people. Like you had talked about the reverse drop set from the beginning. I know that was murderous. But I still didn't get like feedback of people like, I'm never progressing. My lats are always sore. I'm systemically fatigued. I have sleep disruption, and I'm not dealing with these hundreds of people on that intimate of a basis. But I would suspect to have enough feedback about that this is killing people. And I'm just thinking that we're still within this construct, these parameters of times per week and all this stuff. Like we're just very unlikely to reach like systemic overload.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is credit to you for being prudent with the way that you program the really highly fatiguing movements too. Because like taking, like we've just said, like taking a lateral raise or a cable row or something like that and doing partials or reverse drop sets or whatever it is, like that's not the thing that's going to drive people to the point of like, oh my God, my life, I just can't handle it. It's going to be like some idiot who comes in and programs like 3 sets of RDLs to failure in week 2. And like, before you know it, you're doing 6 sets of Bulgarians per leg, with 1 minute of rest in between or something like that. That's the type of stupid stuff that ends up crushing people. But if you're prudent with if you're saying we're doing most of the time, we're doing 2 sets of Bulgarians at most, I can't remember the last time I programmed 3 sets of Bulgarians to anybody. Because 2 is just, God, your soul.
Not to cut you off there. I want you to go on your rep, but I am working with shout out. I work with a company called Active Life, which is like online PTs for my ankle. I just have I'm realizing this was a serious injury and I'm pretty fucked up. And so I really need someone to take over like the plyometric side of things where and the ankle specific stuff. But I was like, fuck it, man, take the leg training all together because maybe there's more specific stuff we can do, more unilateral stuff, more lower stability, potentially worse for hypertrophy. But first day of the program, it was like 4 sets of 10 Bulgarians at like a 7 out of 10 RPE. And it was like 4 sets of 10 RDL, barbell RDL. And I remember writing in my sheet on True Coach, and I was like, 2 sets of 6 Bulgarian at 55. And then 2 sets of, there was like 3 sets of 6 at 255 on the RDL. And he was like, what's up, man? I was like, oh, I'm just not doing more than that. Like, that's just like, I'm not doing more than 6 reps of these. And I'm not doing 4 sets of Bulgarians. Like, I just can't.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a really funny story. Yeah. I think that the Active Life crew is used to working with CrossFitters that are so like volume centric and they don't understand proximity to failure. Like RPE 7 to them is just like, it's just a number. Yeah, it's an emotion. It's an emotional state. Exactly. Yeah. That's really funny though. So anyways, that's more what I'm saying is that you're doing a great job, as am I, of programming the highly fatiguing movements with less volume and less proximity to failure, or more proximity to failure, whatever it is, further from failure. And so I think that that's kind of the whole gist there of keeping people fresh. But I will say that, you know, I do have people on occasion be like, man, I'm really ready for the deload week type thing. And that's not to say that they killed themselves and they're systemically fatigued or anything like that. But like, hey, after you train hard for 5 or 6 weeks, like you kind of earn the deload week. So go ahead, get it done.
How do you feel about that? How do you feel about, it's so funny. I'm in, my group is in like a peak week, whatever, the last week before deload. And I've had like people message me like, man, I'm really ready for the deload. Like, do you take that as feedback as like, maybe I'm tiptoeing on the edge of too much? Or do you take that as like a fucking finally, like, you know, like finally you're at a place where, you know, feeling ready for a deload is still might actually be like feeling emotionally ready for a deload might be far away from actual overtraining, but might be closer to it than you've ever been potentially. And so I usually take that with like a good, I mean, sometimes I'm a bit more sympathetic, but I'm usually taking that as like a mission accomplished sort of thing. If you can get to, dude, get to that state with somebody after 5 weeks of 4 times a week training, which is not nothing, by the way, 4 times a week, I'm a big advocate, but you have people that are training 6 times a week and never getting to that point. And so it is a sign of like, you're being effective with what you're doing. Yeah.
The way I look at it and the response I always get is good, as expected. You've earned your deload, you know,
right?
That's exactly my response. Like, well earned. And I think that it doesn't, I think I would be more concerned about it if I thought that the reason they needed the deload was systemic more than psychological. But as you and I have discussed so many times, like the desire to deload is almost always going to be psychological. And so that is the default that I use with people until I hear otherwise.
Yep. I don't know how much time you have left. I have like 10, 12 minutes here. So I don't know if you have any extra time, but we were going to
12:15 is good. Yeah, let's go until then.
Perfect. I'm going to save the discussion of rep ranges. I know you and Aaron just did a podcast on that, and I'm going to link it in the description, but there are a couple points I would love to chat about on here. So maybe we'll have you back on for that. That in and of itself could be a whole discussion, but segueing into what you just said, where it's like this need for a deload is like almost always psychological, not physiological. You're not running into like an inability to progress in most cases. Like that has to do with the experiment that I've been doing in my training, but we have not talked about your experiment that you're doing with your training. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. So just a matter of like 2 weeks ago, I finally decided to accept all the badgering from Dr. Dave McConey and do a unilateral experiment. So the background is essentially this dude, Dave, he has a podcast. You guys should check it out. It's called Brains and Gains. But for 2 years now, he's only been training one of his calves. And he has a bunch of training experience. I think he's at 17 or 18 years of training, similar to myself at 25. And so he has seen no difference from 2 years of training only one of his calves. And he and I in DMs and stuff, we've chatted about this and some of the reasons why. And the theory is kind of that A, he's close to his genetic limit for calf growth. B, he does sprints twice a week. And so he's providing a ton of force through his calf and walking on it every day. And we know that maintenance volume for muscles is so much lower than it is to actually build. And so maybe there's just this crazy confluence of events where he is doing enough volume through running and sprinting and walking that his calf is not shrinking. As to why the other one isn't growing, that has to go back to the kind of the genetic peak. Like he's just reached his ceiling of potential growth for his calves. So I decided did he spend any of that time in a surplus? Were there phases of that were spent in a calorie surplus? Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, over 2 years, he's gone from 200 to 180 and then back to 200. And now he's hanging out around 200. Cool. So
yeah, that's interesting stuff.
Yeah.
So what are you doing?
So my experiment is for arms. I have always noticed my left arm being less coordinated, less developed. It has less definition. Like the vein structure in my right arm is more prominent. I just feel like on every movement that I do, I kind of have to cheat my left arm on the final rep. It's always one rep, whether it's like an iliac pull down, my left arm is always struggling a little, or if it's a one arm, face away cable curl, my left arm always has to get a little like kind of, come on, buddy, for the last rep. And so I just decided that, I may as well just train my left arm for 6 months and not train my right arm at all with any direct work and see what happens. So I'm now 2 weeks in, which has been three bicep sessions and 3 tricep sessions. Maybe it's more than 2 weeks, whatever it is. It's 3 of each of those sessions so far. And it feels weird, man. Like every day I finish training my left arm and there's just this massive pump on the left side of my body. And it's not just like locally in my arm. It's also like kind of in my trap and like my upper back and my shoulder, and like the whole left side of my body just for a couple hours feels a little bit off compared to the right side, like a kind of deflated balloon versus a blown up balloon type thing. But I'm really excited about it because like I said earlier regarding the lengthened only sets that I'm doing, there's got to be some shit to keep me interested now. And this is one of those things where wouldn't it be cool if I discover that nothing happens and then I can kind of just stop training arms? Like what if,
there's so many, I'm upset that we are going down this route because now I have so many questions. Like if outcome X happens, what's your hypothesis? If outcome Y happens, what's your hypothesis? And what do you do about either of those? Fuck, man, I got 8 minutes, but all right, let me poke around. So like, what do you think will happen?
Yeah. So I think my hypothesis is that
I answered this on your Instagram already. You asked do you think something would happen? So I have an answer, but you go.
Yeah, I think nothing will happen. I think that my right arm will stay the same because doing like one arm pull downs and doing
training back and
presses and shoulders and stuff will be enough to maintain the muscle on my right arm. And then the really depressing part is that I also kind of expect my left arm not to grow at all.
Are you in a surplus?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I'm in a maintaining type thing. Although I've let it get a little carried away over the last 4 weeks and my weight has gone from like low 190s to high 190s in a month. And so there's like certainly a part of me that really wants to mini cut right now, just because it is getting a little carried away. But I'm going to do my best to at least stay on the higher side of maintenance as an average. So I may have like a couple like down days throughout the week, but make sure to kind of keep the food at least at a maintenance plus as a general average throughout the week.
I think both outcomes are like a combination of interesting and depressing. Like it would be great if nothing happened and it would be awful if nothing happened.
Yeah,
it could be great if nothing happened because you're like, wow, maintenance volume means, just doing enough like the elbow flexion extension work I get from presses and pulls is maintenance volume for my arm. Like how amazing is that for me long term? If your left arm, like that's on one side of your right arm doesn't shrink, amazing. If your left arm doesn't grow, fucking depressing as shit.
Yeah. So it kind of makes me wonder, like, should I just reduce all volume everywhere? Like, should I just do like 1 or 2 sets of every movement that I'm doing and just kind of just accept that I'm 40 years old and I've been training 25 years and there just like isn't much more growth to be had, which is like super, super depressing, but also completely amazing for like other aspects of life and like getting into other things. And totally. So there's a lot of emotions floating around here.
Yeah, totally a wonderful like intersection of depressing and awesome. Like it is. I feel that 100%. I actually was feeling that way about my own training where I was like, like unless I'm like things, if they are happening over the last couple of years, which I've not spent any of that time in a surplus, let's say 2 years, if things are happening, they're happening at a microscopic rate. And if nothing's happening, how do I feel about that? I feel great because honestly, my training feels just very sustainable. I could do this forever. And chances are I think I could probably do less if the goal was to maintain. But at the same time, it's like, well, that would be depressing. But at the same time, that would be awesome because do I need to get much bigger? No, I would train anyway, even if it meant no more growth, just for the health benefits. Yeah. Do I think your left arm will get bigger over 6 months, having spent any of that time in a surplus? I do. There are just so many places to go down. Do I think it will be by an amount you can see and detect? No, I don't. So I think your end result, if it's like a mirror measurement, will be no. It will be the same. If it's like a muscle biopsy, I think it will grow. But is a muscle biopsy like just at that one point in time the same? Because maybe there's more glycogen in there. I don't know how that affects a muscle biopsy. It would be, yeah, man. I'm interested to see. I mean, obviously, I'm sure you took an extensive amount of pictures or whatever. Like you just, or is it more of just like, hey, if it's not enough to notice, I shouldn't need extensive pictures to figure it out.
So I have 2 forms of measurement, and I'm not using pictures. Although I do have videos of my training every day.
What are your measurements? DEXA?
So I measured my arms with literally like a shoestring type thing, like one of those cloth tape measures. And it was 17 inches on the right and 16 3/4 on the left. I measured 3 times each arm just to be sure that it was right. So 17 and 16.75 are going to be what I'm going to go with there. And then I also have a DEXA from 6 weeks before I started the experiment. The only confounding issue with the DEXA is that I was 193 pounds. And so for me to get back now to 193 pounds, I would have to go into a deficit, which could fuck the whole experiment up. So I'm not 100% sure how to use that data, but they do the unilateral measurements. And so on that DEXA at 193 pounds, I had 12.2 pounds of muscle in my right arm and 11.8 pounds of muscle in my left arm. So we could just look at that ratio. And then if I do another DEXA at 200 pounds body weight, it could be 12.5 and 12.3. And then I would look at that and be like, oh, look, like that's awesome. Or whatever it ends up being, I can kind of figure it out from there.
That's how you'd have to do it. The secondary question of will my arm grow would require you to be the same size, but the ratio of will my left arm grow more than my right arm grows? If my whole body grows, then I think that that's a really still a good takeaway. I'm fascinated to see what happens. Kudos to you, man, because there's, the confounding variable for your enjoyment level of this is maybe this is like, you know what I'm saying? Like I first saw this, I was like, wow, he's really sacrificing like potentially, 6 months of arm growth on one side, but the counter might be that you're going to do this with the smaller side. And in like worst case, you're like fixing an asymmetry, which I'm sure you don't really give a shit about, but it's the silver lining thing. That's like, hey, I'm not really wasting it, yeah, that's cool. I definitely want to get you back on here. We'll talk about that. I have a podcast coming out about my update with my experiment. I'm closing in on the end of mesocycle 4, and things have had to change, and the reasonings behind them are just not surprising at all. Yeah.
No, I've been following along closely. I listened to the last update that you did on it. So I'm also very intrigued to follow your journey as well. I mean, these experiments, I kind of feel like it's Dave McConey in my ear for the last 2 years. So some of this might just be the reflection of that. But I really feel like at this point of the training journey where not much is changing, I'm the perfect candidate to actually do these N of 1 experiments to be like, hey, if anything is going to work at all, if it's going to work on me, then it can be extrapolated out, to other people. So, and then if not, you have the other side of the coin where there's some good and some bad that come with that. So,
yep. Cool, man. We both got to run. I appreciate you coming on. I'll tag in everything when it comes out. If you don't follow Bryan already, go give him a follow on Instagram, but living under a rock at this point. But anything else that you got coming up that you want to drop?
New cycles in Paragon starting 10/24. This will probably come out after that, but we're doing a shoulders and quads focus for this next cycle, and then hams and arms after that. So
cool.
Should be fun to kind of do some unique stuff. But yeah, thanks for having me on, dude.
Sounds good, man. Pleasure as always. See you, bro.